Thank you for attending. Thank you for coming. I hope this is useful to you. It's all about this, preventing the preventable and looking at why tech diving accidents still happen and, importantly, what you can do to stop them. I think it's quite likely that I'll talk about some things tonight that are going to be normal for you, and that's fine. It's going to hopefully reinforce some of the things that you're doing. And some of it perhaps will be new, and it will give you some more ideas that you can take away into your own diving, your own instruction. I'm really hoping that you can take at least one thing away to try and look at why tech diving accidents still happen, and importantly, what you can do to stop them. I'll just start with an apology. I get a tickly cough about once a year, and I'm now slap bang in the middle of it, so I will occasionally have to just take a break for me to clear my throat. Right, moving on. Now, a lot of people may not know too much about me. I know a few people do. I recognize a few names on here, but a lot of people probably don't know much about me, Mike Mason. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes giving you about my background to give you some ideas about why I think I'm here talking to you tonight. I spent 20 years in the Royal Air Force, mostly flying fighters like this one here. And then I spent the last 5 years in the Australian Air Force flying this airplane here as an instructor, teaching the next generation of fighter pilots. I've also got a commercial flying license. And what does that really mean? It means that I've been pretty much living and breathing human factors and non-technical skills for my entire professional career. It doesn't really matter how capable your airplane is or your weapon system or your radar. It's what's in your head. It's your brain that counts. And it's exactly the same in the world of diving as well. Speaking of which, I am a dive master. I work for a local dive shop here on the east coast of Australia, taking people out to the local dive sites. And I'm also a tech diver in my own right, as it were. I'm Mod 2 qualified honorary breather, and I'm trying to do more and more exploration of the deeper wrecks off the coast of New South Wales here in Australia. About 7 years ago, I came across the human diver, and the messages that the human diver were putting across instantly made sense to me, because it was all the same concepts, ideas, processes, thoughts, but rather than in flying language, it was in diving language. And I thought, oh, this is brilliant. So I reached out to Gareth, the founder of the Human Diver team, and I said, hey, this is me. I'd really like to get involved. And the rest, as they say, is history. And I've been the human diver in Australia and kind of southeast corner of the world, Southeast Asia, for the last 3 or 4 years. And if you don't know much about the human diver, I'll talk a bit more about it on one of the last slides, but you can see our motto here in the top right of the screen. This is what we're about, making you better than yesterday by teaching you how to get more out of your brain rather than just the pure technical skills that a lot of diving courses focus on. So that's me. Let's talk about why we're here. Why have we all joined this presentation tonight? So Phil Jennings, who's online, he and I got together about 2 months ago, I think, 3 months ago perhaps, with a view to trying to get some discussion going in the Philippine diving community about human factors as a result of there being several fatalities over the last few years in dive training. Now, as is the norm, depressingly perhaps, in the diving industry, there's not much specific detail, if any, really, about these diving accidents other than the final cause of death, which doesn't really help us learn. And it's a big problem with the culture of diving, which we at the Human Diver are trying to change, where if you have a near miss or, heaven forbid, an accident, you actually feel empowered, encouraged to share the lessons from those stories to help other people learn so it doesn't happen to them. But in reality, the diving industry is not really there yet. So those learning opportunities are largely lost. And certainly when it comes to fatalities, they're not really very good learning opportunities at all, because the person with the most learning is usually dead. And you've often got litigation, legal action associated as well. So things get really close hold and kept under wraps. And when we hear about near misses or accidents, we make a lot of assumptions. Our biases kick in about, oh, I wouldn't do that. That wouldn't happen to me. It's not that simple. Now, what I want to try and get you to think about when it comes to accidents or incidents or near misses is when something happens, try not to think about what somebody did, but more about why did they do what they did? What led to them making those decisions? Because invariably, when people make decisions, they're doing them for, in their own heads, a good reason. Or rather than the cause of an accident or incident, dig into the cause of the cause. Environmental conditions. What pressures were people under? What was the context? Was it a novel dive? Was it a familiar dive? What was people's previous experience like? What was people's training like? Et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. There's a lot to it, and it's rarely one simple cause. In fact, it's never one single cause in my experience. And what will often happen is we'll have a diving incident or an accident, and people will say, human error. This was caused by human error. Now, the problem with that is that you can't fix human error. James Reason, who invented the Swiss cheese model about 25 years ago, this is one of the most famous things he said. You cannot fix human error. What you can do is look at the systems that humans find themselves in and find ways to stop human error occurring. Or if it does happen, because it will, you can minimize the impact. And I would argue that rather than human error being a cause of an accident, it's a consequence of a failed system. The system that you're in has allowed that human error to occur, to manifest such that we've had an incident, or worse still, an accident with a fatality. And we in the diving world operate in complex systems. And when I say complex, I mean they're complex because there's lots of human interactions. You've got instructors, instructor trainers, training agencies, equipment manufacturers, dive masters, boat crews, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. And all those people will interact in multiple unpredictable ways that you cannot possibly predict. But what you can try and do is look at these complex systems and put in multiple points of failure to minimize the chances of a single point of failure having a serious outcome. So that's a few words, or perhaps a lot of words, to talk about this. Let's have a look at a picture of what I'm trying to get across. This is James Reason's Swiss cheese model, which I'm sure a lot of you will have seen before. And traditionally, it's drawn in this static, two-dimensional sense, as it were. And what it's trying to depict is that in any given system, we have our barriers, our layers of defenses here that are represented by the layers of cheese. But because you've got humans making those barriers, there are human error represented by the holes in the cheese. And normally, this is drawn statically like so. But in reality, it's actually quite dynamic. And as time progresses through the system that we're in, these holes will move, they'll open, they'll close. And it's only when they come together at the same time that something actually goes wrong and we have an incident. And it's really easy with hindsight to look back up from our unsafe act and see these things and go, should have fixed those. They were obvious. They probably weren't obvious. They were probably there all the time. But because they never happened in combination with other things, nobody had bothered to fix them or even seen them as being a problem. So let's just take some examples. Organizational influence. The diving agencies that are out there are commercial entities. And as a result, they have to make money. And we talk about safety being the number one priority. And don't get me wrong, that safety should be a high priority. But if it was the top priority all the time over everything else, diving agencies wouldn't exist. They'd go bankrupt. So there has to be a trade-off. That's a fact. That's life. That's the way it is. But we have to consider that when it comes to organizational influence over what we're trying to achieve. And that stems down a little bit into this next layer here, unsafe supervision. It's not particularly common to have a really solid, robust quality management, quality assurance program amongst our dive training agencies. It does happen sometimes to a certain extent, but it's nowhere near as robust as it could be. And that inevitably leads to things just creeping into instructional technique and standards, and you'll have some more holes potentially happening in the unsafe supervision layer. Preconditions for unsafe acts. This can include things like our environmental conditions, the pressures people are under, fatigue, distraction, etc., etc. They will all add up. And then we have our unsafe acts at the end. These are what we traditionally blame accidents on. Mistakes, errors, violations, but in reality, there's a lot more things that lead to them actually being a problem. So we've got our system here, our dive system. And we could say that the more we can know about our system, the safer we're going to be. But it's not quite that simple. I would certainly agree that more knowledge means you will be safer, but it doesn't mean you'll be safe as an absolute term. Just because you have lots of knowledge doesn't mean you're going to be safe. Just because we know the max operating depth of the gases we've got doesn't prevent us from exceeding them. We'll assume that because somebody has done the training, they know the numbers, they understand the risks, they'll make the right call when it counts. But human performance just doesn't really work like that. In a real dive or a training dive, but when you're actually under the water, you're managing multiple demands. You're looking at your depth, you're achieving neutral buoyancy, you might have task loading. If you're on a training course, you might be following a script as part of a scenario. And when you've got all these things going on, the brain will simplify things, it'll cut corners, and you will just switch to a high PO2 gas, but something's different on this dive. It's perhaps become routine. and you'll forget that you're below the depth that you should be for the actual gas you've got. And the risk that we often have with this kind of thing is if nothing goes wrong, we're exposed to this concept called the normalisation of deviance, where we just take gradual steps away from what's considered the rules, the standards, the normal procedures, and it feels okay. I've done this before, nothing went wrong. Or the instructor said it was okay because nothing had happened to the instructor and therefore it must be fine. Now, normalisation of deviance is not consciously going out and knowingly breaking the rules. It feels socially, mentally acceptable and perhaps right to break these or to push these rules and push these boundaries. And importantly, this is normal human behavior. It happens all the time. I recently found a YouTube video from a friend of mine in the UK who does a lot of deep wreck diving, and he has kind of openly declared, as it were, that when he and his team, and they do some pretty serious deep wreck diving, down to below 100 meters quite regularly, when it comes to bailout planning, they almost don't really have like a proper plan. They just have some cylinders themselves. And then if they need some more gas, they'll get it off their teammates. And if they still need some more gas, they'll get it from the service. And that's the plan. And it's like, wow, okay. They've got a lot of experience. They've been doing it a long time. And I haven't had an in-depth conversation with Dom, the guy that posted this video, who knows a lot more about diving than I do. But it's a classic example of what I would say could be normalization of deviance. And it's important to kind of have these conversations, I think. So that's great. Normalization of deviance, it exists. What can we do about it? How can we fix it? First of all, you have to have standards and procedures in the first place. And we're generally quite good at doing that at a kind of baseline course agency level. But when you get into the more complicated aspects of tech diving, or more, let's call it serious tech diving, mod 2 and beyond, it all gets a little bit vague, for want of a better word. Do we have solo bailout? Do we have team bailout? Do we have dual rebreathers? What gas amounts do we actually cater for? There's an awful lot of opinions on how much gas you should carry based on all the assumptions that go into it. And I understand why all these opinions happen, but it's important that the teams that you're in try and have the standards, have the procedures, have the baselines, such that you can work as a team with leaders and followers working together effectively so you can hold each other accountable. So when you see these standards being pushed, when you see somebody not doing their checks, when you see somebody not analyzing the gas or not labeling the cylinders correctly, you call them out and you say, hey, I don't think that cylinder's been analyzed properly. And it's not to do with making people look stupid. It's to do with holding each other to account so you all get out of the water safely. Most fatal errors in high-risk industries, and I would quantify diving as a high-risk industry, they happen not because people didn't know the rules, but because the situation they were in felt normal enough to them to let the rules slip. And it felt okay until it wasn't. Now let's talk about some of the more perhaps specific individual human factors in the tech diving world. This slide's quite busy. That's deliberate to try and give you some idea about the scale of the problem, perhaps. It is just still scratching the surface, though. It does not have all the answers, I can assure you. It just gives you some things to think about. So first of all, we've got a cognitive load, certainly in training. Now, that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good idea that we load our students up in a safe training environment such that they can fail safely, and in the real world, they'll have a much higher stress tolerance level to deal with potentially serious problems. We're often busy managing multiple tasks. We'll be doing gas switches, maintaining neutral buoyancy, doing emergency drills while maintaining that bigger picture situation awareness. But we're often doing these at the same time, and that will naturally lead to us having divided attention. We cannot pay focused, conscious attention to more than one thing at once. We think we can. My wife would probably say we could, but in reality, it's not that simple. You can pay partial attention to more than one thing, but you cannot focus completely on more than one thing at once. This is a really good reason why videoing dives is great, because at the time, even the instructor won't be able to see everything because they'll just be focused on looking for particular outcomes from the students, and they might miss little details. That's normal human behavior. But by videoing it, you can have a look at it in slow time later and pick up all those little things that you can improve on for next time. We have an authority gradient a lot of the time. This is to do with instructors kind of being on a bit of a pedestal and then students being somewhere kind of down here. And that authority gradient makes it harder, certainly for the students, to communicate and challenge the instructors. This has widely been recognized as a major cause of flying accidents for decades and decades. And airlines and aviation industries do their best to try and flatten that gradient out to enable people to challenge the problem. because we can ask the question, should students be pushing back on their instructors? I think they should. I think we need to create that environment where it's okay to ask those questions, raise those concerns or those issues to make sure that nothing gets left misunderstood. Because we'll often have communication breakdowns. And these are often as a result of assumptions. Now, assumptions are not necessarily a bad thing. We can work as efficiently and effectively as we do as human beings because of assumptions. They allow us to move through life really, really quickly. The flip side is, if you don't validate the critical assumptions, you can have problems, especially if you can't rewind the clock once you've made that decision. This is why we do checks. This is why we analyze our gas. Those are things that you need to, those are assumptions you need to validate to make sure that you're going to have your equipment working for you and save your life. This point here, the risk of not speaking up, what this is to do with is if you're in a brief or a plan or the actual dive and you see something or hear something and you're not sure about it and you think, oh, do I say something and on the off chance nothing's going to happen? You're weighing up the risk of, definitely putting yourself out there and potentially being ridiculed as a result versus the relatively low risk of something going wrong. Or do you just keep quiet and not take that risk and the chances are nothing will happen anyway? And we weigh up those options all the time. And the more the authority gradient exists, the harder it is to potentially speak up and say something, which can obviously have some quite serious consequences, potentially. And we have pressure, time pressure, classic example. The weather gets in the way of our diving, starts cutting into the start of a course, and all of a sudden you've got more and more dives to do with fewer and fewer days left. And we want to keep pushing the boundaries to make sure that we get done what we need to get done. Social pressures. Nobody wants to be that person that's struggling with a particular skill that's kind of being left behind from their peers. We don't want to be made to look stupid in front of our friends. We want to be, at the head of the pack, or certainly not at the back of the pack. And it doesn't matter if those pressures are perceived or real, because in your head, it's the same thing. Perception versus reality when it comes to this kind of issue doesn't make a difference. So like I said, that slide is quite busy. There's a lot to it deliberately, but it's really just scratching the surface of some of the problems that we come up against in the tech diving world from a human factors point of view. Let's move on to think a little bit about the training culture and what are we really trying to get across in the courses that we do. Are we training divers to just pass a class, tick the boxes, demonstrate skill proficiency, and then move on, kick them out the door? Or are we training divers to really think about what they're doing and generate a positive, onward-going learning culture? So consider this model here, where at the start of a class, you've got your instructor in the middle and the 3 students around the outside. And at the start of that class, it's going to be a relatively autocratic leadership style. And that's not a bad thing, because at the start, the students don't really know what they don't know, and the instructor will demonstrate a skill. The students will repeat the skills back. Brilliant, that's good, we can move on. But as the class progresses and time progresses, then the students' technical skill competency will develop, their teamwork skills will develop, their ability to work as a team and learn and improve as a team, such that at the end of the class, what you want as the instructor is to be able to stand to one side and let the students lead the dives, because you're trying to generate autonomous, effective, efficient diving teams that go beyond the class. Now, the instructor still needs to be there during the class as a safety blanket to make sure things are done properly and they don't go too badly wrong. But you want to be able to let the students think, make decisions, and graduate as effective thinking divers and team divers. So I'm just going to bring us back to the title slide. Tech diving accidents still happen, not because of one thing happening at a time, but because lots of little things all come together that in isolation don't really matter when they happen, but when they come together in such a way that's critical, then you risk having a serious outcome or an accident. And it's pretty much impossible to predict how and when those things are going to come together. So in terms of stopping them, what you need to do is look at all those little things and try and stop as many of them as you can, such that they will never, ever come together to manifest as an accident at once. And that requires us to build a learning culture and a safety culture that works for us in our diving systems. And the bedrock, the foundation of creating that culture, is what we call psychological safety. People may have heard this term before. It's quite common in the business world these days. And in simple terms, and I emphasize simple terms because people have written whole books about psychological safety, It's an environment where people feel able to, one second. It's an environment where people feel comfortable and able to put their hand up and say, I've got a question, I don't know, I don't understand. Can you please explain that a different way? Difficult to do, but it's important that instructors create this environment. Instructors, leaders, and there are plenty of them on this call tonight, create that space where when people put their hand up and ask these questions, raise these concerns, highlight their doubts, you welcome it. You say thank you for bringing it to their attention. Don't ridicule people. Absolutely critical to enable the culture that we want to have. And psychological safety then feeds into building effective briefings. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about briefings because I know we're all going to be pretty experienced with briefing. I'm just going to give you a few ideas about what I think can make a briefing perhaps more effective. So first of all, we want to have a structure. And the reason you want to have a structure that is understood by both the person giving the brief and the people receiving the brief is to allow both parties to follow through in a timely manner and make sure that things don't get missed. As part of that structure, and early on in the particular briefing structure, it's important for the person running the brief to show humility. If you're doing a training dive, talk about a skill, associated relevant skill that you found difficult once upon a time, or a mistake that you made that potentially had a consequence. Or if you're going and exploring a wreck, talk about somewhere on the wreck that you got lost or confused or made a bad decision. It doesn't matter, but by showing that level of humility, creates psychological safety, encourages other people to ask the right questions so that everybody knows what's going on and you've got the right mindset going in. And when you're running your briefings, ask questions. Perhaps at the end, certainly during the brief to keep people engaged, especially if the brief's quite detailed, because humans only have a finite attention span. And these three letters here, PPP, stand for pose, pause, pounce. And the idea is that I've given the brief and I say, right, okay, team, when we get to the bottom of the shot line, how are we going to find the bow of the wreck? So I pose the question. Then I pause and just let the team reflect on the idea and sink in. And then I say, Phil. And then Phil gets to give me his answer. If I do it the opposite way around and I say, Phil, everybody else switches off, people aren't paying attention, you've lost them. And the learning potentially is lost. And Phil's now rabbit in the headlights, wondering the myriad thousand questions that I might ask him next. So pose, pause, pounce is really key. What's really critical though, is if Phil gets the answer wrong or doesn't give you the answer that you need, it's more to do with the way you've explained it than the way Phil has actually given you the answer. So it's something to do with the communicator that's the problem, not the person being communicated to. So that's a briefing. That's some ideas on how to develop your briefings. We then do our dive and we want to have a debriefing to get the most learning out. This is quite a similar idea. You need to have a structure for exactly the same reasons as before. So the person running the debrief and those people being debriefed, the team members, can follow through and make sure that nothing gets missed. And it also allows you to get through things in a nice, timely, efficient manner. And again, we want to show humility. One of the first steps is the second step that we do in the human diver debriefing model is you come up with a mistake or an error that you made during the plan, during the brief, during the mission or the dive execution itself, just to show that you're human, you're fallible, that you make mistakes, and it encourages other people to do the same thing. Doesn't matter what it is, but just bring up an error. When I did my Mod 2 a couple of years ago, and we did the final graduation dive, and it was Joe was leading it, I was second, and the instructor was behind. And after we got out of this 60-meter dive, which was great fun, one of the first things the instructor said was, I'm really sorry, guys. I was in a really awkward position for you to see there. I should have been far more up against the side rather than sat behind you the whole time, making life hard. And I was like, that was so, the weight off my shoulders was immense, because I've now got this person who's done more dives than I've had hot dinners, just admitting, an error. It just empowers everybody to speak up and talk about things. It's so, so powerful. Now, we often, which is good, have things that go well during our dives. When we debrief those things, we need to look at why things went well. So look at an outcome, pick an outcome, excuse me, and then look at why things went well. Simple example, about 3 weeks ago, I was doing a wreck dive off Sydney in about 50 meters of water. And we, as a trio of divers, held the bottom time really accurately. As soon as the bottom time was done, we're back at the shot and we're ascending on the way to our first decompression stop. Now, one of the reasons that happened as well as planning and briefing, etc. One of the reasons in terms of execution was when we first got down to the bottom of the shot line, that's when I put air in the shot bag, so we didn't have to waste time at the end of the dive putting air in. And it actually took a couple of minutes longer than I expected, and we would have either wasted time if I'd gone back early or gone over time when it took me longer than I anticipated. So putting air in the shot bag at the start of the bottom time is a good thing to do to enable you to achieve the times that you want. So what went well, and then importantly, why things went well. And then we're going to look at things to improve. Look at the outcome, and then look at actually how you want to improve that outcome. Another example for me, not so long ago, we did a dive, didn't get back to the shot, and all of a sudden it's like, right, we need to put up our DSMBs. But we hadn't really briefed it, although it's a well-known skill, we hadn't talked about how we're going to do it at the time. And we all kind of did it at the same time. And for that minute or so, everybody's focused in on their own DSMB and not looking at everybody else. Now, while we didn't get into any tangles, it was just a bit untidy. Our situation awareness broke down, and we reflected that in future, to avoid that, we're going to put them up in order, which we'll agree at the start of the dive before we even get in the water. So what went wrong, or what needs to be improved, and importantly, how are you going to improve it? So after a debrief, you may well have had a near miss, something a bit more serious that you want to share with other divers, other people in the wider diving community, whether that be on Facebook or amongst the SDI community in the Philippines or whatever. That's fine, but it's really important that we learn from each other's near misses, because you're never going to make all the mistakes yourself, by sharing our stories. I'm going to share a story with you now, which I hope can help you guys learn as well. So this is a picture of me with my rebreather on, just getting out of the water locally. And you can see here I've got my wing inflator hose, and then over here, just behind the pressure gauge, is my manual add valve. Now, I appreciate people don't know much about rebreathers, don't worry too much about the technical aspects of it, but when I'm in the water and in relatively horizontal trim, those two hoses are a lot closer together. And I'm doing my Mod 2 course, we're down at about 45 meters. And one of the really good things about the way we've been trained was that if one of us has an emergency or a problem, you start talking, and with a rebreather, with no bubbles, you can hear each other quite well. And your teammates are instantly on either side of you, ready to support you, because you're going to get task focused quite quickly. So this happened. So Joe's on this side, Tom's on this side, Mike feels comfortable. Mike now gets in a bit of a rush trying to execute this drill. And what he has to do is what's called a diluent flush, which is essentially where I have to push gas into this manual add valve with my left hand, and then dump gas out the other side of my breathing loop on my right hand side. So I grab something down here that feels like a manual add valve, and I pull my dump valve and I start going for it. And then Tom, who's on my right hand side, slaps my hand away, because I've actually grabbed my wing inflator hose, and I'm about to give myself a really serious positive buoyancy problem with a decompression overhead. Not very cool. So the teamwork aspect of that dive worked really well. We'd been trained and we'd briefed to be close together if we needed to be, which stopped the error getting any worse, because when I got to do the drill, in my haste, in my rush, I just went for the wrong thing that felt right but wasn't right, and made a mistake which could have had some pretty serious consequences. So there's good and bad aspects of that story, but certainly learning points for me that I'm quite happy to share with you. So just to recap on those last few slides, building a learning culture and a safety culture that works for the diving that you guys and girls do. It starts with psychological safety. It's a big subject, but it's really important that we as the leaders and instructors create that environment where people feel comfortable putting their hands up and saying, I have a question, I don't agree, I'm not sure, can you please explain that, etc., etc. And we welcome those comments, those suggestions, those doubts. And that feeds into having effective briefings where we've got the right shared mental model when we get in the water, because people are comfortable asking questions, commenting on things they're not sure about. Once we've done our dive, we're then going to have our debriefs, where again, we need to have that level of humility, psychological safety, to actually get those learning points out there. When things have gone well, look at why they went well so you can reinforce that. When things haven't gone so well, what are you going to fix to make sure it doesn't happen again? And potentially we've had something that hasn't gone particularly well, and it's actually what we call a near miss. We want to learn from that. We want to share that story far and wide. So my challenge to you going forward is that if you're an expert diver, and there are plenty of expert divers online tonight, you're not immune from failure. That's not a bad thing. When you fail, or when you have a student or a teammate fail, embrace it. We learn the most from our failures. Just think back over your lives to date. Your most vivid memories in terms of learning experience will be things that you've gone wrong, things that you've got wrong. That's natural, that's human, and it's good. It's how we learn from those things. So embrace them, learn from them, share them, because we want to be the instructor, the leader, the diver, that when we share our stories, other people will come to us as well. They'll choose us to talk to share their stories with. That's the person that you want to be. We want to normalize as a group these potentially uncomfortable conversations. Now, I do accept that me talking to you for half an hour about this is not going to change the culture overnight, but hopefully it's a start. Hopefully it's given you some ideas about how this can work and what's important. The final slide. If you've enjoyed this presentation and if you've got something out of it or you want to know a bit more, then please have a look at thehumandiver.com, our website. It's got a lot of blog posts on it that goes into lots of detail on some of the concepts I've talked about. It's got a documentary called If Only, which looks at a rebreather fatality through a human factors lens, which is pretty cool. And it also talks about the classes that we offer. The Human Diver Facebook group gets bigger and bigger all the time. I think there's about 13,500 people on there now, which is awesome. Lots of opportunity for a huge spectrum of people to contribute ideas, examples, thoughts, and comments to give you different perspectives and improve your learning. Because while I've been doing this for, human factors for an awfully long time, the Human Diver for the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I still have so much more to learn. I've kind of realized just how much more information there is out there, which is part of the appeal of it, I think. In terms of classes that the Human Diver offers, there's the Essentials class, which I'll put a link to in the notes, in the chat rather afterwards. That's about 3 to 4 hours of pre-recorded material that goes into a lot more detail than the half an hour I've covered tonight. And that's just gone through a revamp, actually, so it's about to be released as an updated version. If you want to get into more of the theory, then we have the Masterclass series. That is a 10-week webinar series, 2 hours per week for 10 weeks. It's about 90 minutes of webinar and then half an hour of reflection and chatting and discussion afterwards. Again, lots of learning, lots of opportunity as the group to share stories and help get something out of it. And then we have the Applied class, which is 2 days, 2 busy days. And there is a bit of theory, but this is much more about the experiential learning. So as well as opportunities to share stories and reflect on those stories, we use a computer simulation program to actually fully immerse you in a scenario where you have to brief, then you have to execute, and then debrief that scenario in a novel environment. The idea being that you get lots of practice and coaching at briefing and debriefing and drawing the lessons out, and then you go and do the simulation again and again so you get better and better at it, and then we draw the lessons out from a diving point of view for obvious reasons. So the idea is that 2 days of the Applied class helps build psychological safety, gets people sharing stories, and gives you lots of practice at briefing and debriefing to bring it all together. We're also working on the Learning from Unintended Outcomes course, which is very much focused on how we can dig into accidents and incidents and actually get the most learning out. This is a product we're working on. And the final resource, which I think is a really good one, is me. So hopefully I've given you the impression for the last half an hour or so that I really enjoy this. I'm really quite passionate about what the Human Diver does, how human factors can improve your diving. So please reach out. I'll put my email address in the chat as well if you're not friends with me on Facebook. Contact me anytime with specifics, generic, whatever. I really do enjoy helping people learn about their human factors in diving, because we at the Human Diver are all about making you better than yesterday. That is our mantra. All right, I will stop the share. And I'll stop the recording as well.